on June 2024. Kenya, a country in the East African region with a population of 47.6 million people, saw widespread protests throughout the country against the deeply unpopular tax hikes on essential items. Now, initially these protests were very peaceful, but eventually they turned out to be violent, with Nairobi, the capital of the region, seeing a widespread violent clash on June 25.
Kenya, where the security forces have clashed with hundreds of protesters opposed to tax hikes put forward by the government. Riot police, some on horseback, have been deployed in the capital, Nairobi, and have fired tear gas in an effort to disperse the demonstrators.
When the crowd of protesters, they stormed the parliament, and the police reiterated and police retaliated with the use of force and with the use of live bullets. Now, one very important thing to note here is that these protests are mainly led by the Gen Z activists. Without any official leadership, they have been mainly organized online through different social mediums. Now, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights said that till July 1st, close to 39 Kenyans have died in the clash, or have died during the protests, and more than 361 people have been injured, and they have been accusing police of wrongdoings, excesses, and also use of disproportionate force against the protesters. Also, 32 cases of enforced disappearances along with the 627 protesters being arrested have also been reported by this organization. And while we are talking, these numbers are significantly going up day after day. Now, these bills are set to have a significant impact on Kenya's economy and the daily lives of people. Now, what this issue is all about, why IMF is dictating terms to Kenya, what are the conditions put forward by IMF to Kenya, and on a broader perspective, on a broader level, what is the role played by IMF in the developing worlds, and overall how IMF came to be known as the overlord of developing world. All these things we'll be trying to understand in this particular session. Hello, my name is Preetpal Singh, and today's topic is International Monetary Fund, the overlords of the developing world. Now, let's first understand the issue. So, in 2021, Kenya basically signed a 4-year loan agreement with IMF, International Monetary Fund, to the tune of $2.34 billion. Also, another deal was signed on May 2023, raising up the total loan limit to $3.6 billion. Now, as the part of 2021 loan deal, Kenya had to increase its revenue collection by 25% of its GDP. That means IMF forced Kenya to go for austerity measures. And this included the demands for tax hikes and also cuts in the spending of the government. So, in order to ensure fiscal consolidation in the country. And it also included significant cuts in the subsidies provided on fuel and electricity in the country. And also cut in the expenditure on education and healthcare in the country. Now, eventually, the president of Kenya, Mr. Ruto, bowed down to the public pressure and said that he will not be signing the controversial bill raising the taxes on essential items including cooking oil, including diapers, including food items, and several other essential necessities. Now, the question is this something new for Kenya? The answer is absolutely not. And this is not new for African region as well, because since last many decades, from 1970s, 80s, 90s, governments of this particular region find themselves caught between the interest of its people and the interests of the Western banks, private investors, which are basically fronted by the International Monetary Fund. Now, IMF has basically described itself as being governed and working towards the betterment of its member countries. However, the history and the structure of the IMF shows a altogether different story. Now, many experts argue that over the last many decades, IMF has turned itself as an organization to serve as a tool for America's financial policy and also to serve basically the Western financial elites. Now, in order to clearly interpret that how International Monetary Fund became the overlords of the developing world, first we need to understand IMF as an organization. Then we need to know its structure and also its key functions and basic functions. Only then we'll be able to get a better sense out of this topic and out of this whole scenario. Now, if you remember, in 1991, India also suffered major economic crisis. That was the balance of payment crisis 1991. At that period of time also, we got $2.2 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. And if you remember the path-breaking reforms which happened during that period of time, these were the liberalization, privatization and globalization reforms, LPG reforms, which were in a part imposed by the IMF to our country. So IMF gave certain conditions while granting the $2.2 billion loan to India, and these conditions conditions in a way eventually transformed into LPG reforms. So India is also having a very deep relationship with the International Monetary Fund when it relates to taking loans and following the conditions put forward by the IMF. Now, if we have to look back to history, the current financial system of the world can be dated back to the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, which happened in New Hampshire, United States of America. Now, what happened in this Bretton Woods Conference? It eventually led to the formation of two very important international institutions. One was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that is IBRD, which is currently known as the World Bank, and second was the formulation of International Monetary Fund, which eventually together came to be known as Bretton Woods Twins. Now, this International Monetary Fund was formed to serve three very important missions. First was to ensure international monetary cooperation. Second was to ensure enhancement of trade and economic growth in the entire world. And third was to discourage policies harming the prosperity in the entire world. Now, IMF is currently having 190 members, and IMF is currently fulfilling three prominent roles in order to serve the missions it is having. First is to ensure surveillance and prevent economic crisis in all the member countries of the world through policy advice. Second is lending to the member countries in case of balance of payment difficulties. Third is to ensure prevention and reduction of money laundering and terrorism in the world. Now, for the smooth fulfillment of its functions, its organizational structure includes three different heads. First is the Board of Governors, second is the Executive Board, and third is Managing Director who heads the IMF. Now, IMF is also having a system of quota, which is basically the building block of IMF, and it determines what will be the financial contribution of each member country to the IMF, what will be the voting power, and eventually how much loan each country can get from IMF. That is decided on the basis of IMF quota of a particular country in that particular International Monetary Fund. Now, IMF is also having a system of special drawing rights, that is SDR, which serves as the unit of account of IMF and is also an international reserve assets. And it is composed of 5 prominent currencies of the world. Now, these 5 currencies includes US dollar, Chinese renminbi, European euro, British pound, and Japanese yen. Now, Chinese renminbi was added in the year 2016 to this particular basket of currencies. Now, one very important thing to note here is that IMF does not lend money to the countries in case of special projects or in case of a particular project, but they lend money to them on the whole balance of payment crisis or if they are suffering from any foreign exchange emergencies. Now, with this, we can conclude that whenever a member country of the IMF faces any economic volatility, faces balance of payment crisis or foreign exchange disturbances, that they can go to the IMF expecting a loan and expecting assistance from them. Now, with this, we get to know that whenever a member country of IMF is in crisis or is in the balance of payment trouble or is in foreign exchange trouble, they can basically go to the IMF and secure a loan to aid them. But IMF money for the developing countries comes in tranches, and they also come with specified certain conditions. It also periodically reviews the country's progress in achieving those conditions and in implementation of those conditions. And if they are convinced that the country is in track in implementing those conditions, then only they release the next tranche of money. Now, similar conditions were levied on Kenya also when they received money from IMF during the COVID pandemic. Now, these conditions basically included fiscal consolidation, raising the tax revenues of the government, decrease in the spending of the government, and cutting down expenditure on essential services, which includes education, healthcare, and cutting down the subsidies on fuel and electricity, and also imposing higher taxes on the public. Now, these conditions are not new for Kenya, and they are not new for African regions as a whole. Because over the last many decades, definitely many experts believe that IMF has become a tool of the American financial elites and also represents the supremacy of American economic might. And this can be reiterated with a very interesting fact. Because of convention, traditionally, the president of the World Bank has always been an American citizen. And traditionally, according to the convention, the MD of the IMF International Monetary Fund has always been an European ally of America, or of USA to be specific, which makes many experts believe that IMF and World Bank, they basically carry on the supremacy of the US economy in the entire world. In theory, the function of IMF is basically to aid the developing nations, to help them come out of poverty, to aid them in the time of crisis and to help them so that they can grow and develop and prosper. But in reality, what happens? In reality, IMF puts conditions which are American oriented, which are specifically US market oriented to these developing nations, and basically to turn around their economic order and design it to serve the interests of the American capitalists. And as we know the quota system, you see the voting rights in the IMF. They are not on the basis of one member, one vote, or one country, one vote, but they are based on the quota system which we saw. And the United States of America alone is having close to 16.5% voting rights, while the wealthy G7 nations, they command close to 40% of the voting power. And that is more than all the African nations and all the Latin American nations put together, which shows a stark inequality of haves and have-nots in the International Monetary Fund. Also, the group towards which IMF is responsible, that is the Western nations, is definitely different from the group which goes to the IMF seeking help, which are the poor, underdeveloping and developing countries. So many experts believe that IMF institutionalizes borrower subordination and creditor dominance. As of March 2024, out of Africa's 54 countries, close to 31 countries are having outstanding loans pending with the International Monetary Fund, but they have nothing remotely resembling a say or a vote in the International Monetary Fund. Their say is abysmally low and negligible. Also, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also flagged the bias which is there in the International Monetary Fund, and also said last year that this Bretton Woods system reflected the power relations of 1945.
Our world is becoming unhinged. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Global challenges are mounting. And we seem incapable of coming together to respond. We confront a host of existential threats, from the climate crisis to disruptive technologies, and we do so at a time of chaotic transition. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe had numerous powers. It was truly multipolar, but it lacked robust multilateral institutions, and the result was World War I. A multipolar world needs strong and effective multilateral institutions. Yet, global governance is stuck in time. Look no further than the United Nations Security Council and the Bretton Woods system. They reflect the political and economic realities of 1945, when many countries in this assembly hall were still under colonial domination. The world has changed. Our institutions have not. We cannot effectively address problems as they are if institutions do not reflect the world as it is.
And also flagged that how IMF favors the rich in the allocation of special drawing rights to its members. And he also stated that IMF allocated close to $650 billion of special drawing rights during the pandemic. The G7 countries, with a population of 772 million people, got the SDR allocation of close to $280 billion. And on the other hand, the African region, which is having a population of 1.3 billion people, got only $34 billion allocation of SDRs, which shows high level of inequality in SDR allocation as well. This unequal and unfair relationship of IMF with the countries like Kenya, Ghana, Zambia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and other developing nations as well. This is why many developing countries have been protesting against the IMF, and there have been widespread protests, even violent protests in those countries against the IMF-backed loans, and especially against the IMF-imposed economic policies under the Structural Adjustment Programs, that is SAPs. Now, SAPs, which were adopted by the IMF in 1986, requires the government to cut expenditure on essential items, which includes cutting expenditure on public goods like healthcare, like education, like electricity and some other essentials as well. It involves privatizing state enterprises, reduction of duties and tariffs on imports, and also to implement certain measures so that the country can pursue export-led growth. And the predictable outcome of all these policies, which have been found in the IMF internal research as well, is increasing inequality in those countries. In the famous work, Globalization and Its Discontent, Nobel laureate Joseph E. Stiglitz has criticized IMF programs for increasing income inequality and economic inequality in the developing countries. And he said that with the Gini coefficient, it becomes very clear that IMF programs has a very important role to play in increasing income inequalities in the developing nations, in the developing countries. Now, Jeffrey Sachs argues that IMF's usual prescription is budgetary belt tightening to the countries who are too poor to even own belts. And he also argues that IMF's role as a generalist institution in guiding the macroeconomic reforms needs overhaul. And also an internal study in 2016 of the IMF itself also found out that IMF has been basically overselling the fiscal austerity measures and financial deregulation, which they claim has basically increased financial inequality and economic inequality around the whole world. So for instance, in Ghana, in 1980s, because of the structural adjustment programs of IMF and the conditions put forward by IMF, Ghana had to reduce its public spending on healthcare drastically. So public spending decreased by even 50% in Ghana region during that particular era. And who was to suffer? The commoners, that is the poor people of the country. They suffered due to lack of proper healthcare and education in the region. Also, Zambia's privatization of the copper industry, which was again led by the International Monetary Fund, led to widespread job losses in the region. And by mid-1990s, close to 50,000 miners, they lost their job, which led to catastrophe and economic inequality in the country. Now, faced with the backlash from dozens of countries, IMF definitely introduced social spending floors to basically limit the cut on the public spending on healthcare, education and social security, so that it should not be that major a part of the loan conditionalities put forward by the IMF. But still, the Oxfam analysis of 27 loans for every $1 IMF encouraged the countries to spend on public services, it has told them to cut 6 times of the same value through austerity measures. In 1994, the New York Times described IMF and the World Bank as the overlords of Africa, which again tells us the story, and the African nations including Kenya can tell us that definitely it is the case. And these overlords, they continue to influence economic policies in the Latin American region, in the African region, in the Asian region as well, with the fates of millions and billions of people decided not in their own parliament but in the headquarters of IMF, which is in Washington. Also, many experts have argued that these policies of the IMF amounts to a new form of colonization which does not even require military presence to be there. These developing nations, they are basically caught in a debt trap, they are caught in a debt spiral where they have to take newer loans, fresher loans again from IMF for the repayment of the older loans which they have taken. And in a way, they are becoming colonies of the IMF and of the World Bank. Now, overall, we have understood that what all wrong is there with the IMF, or what all things IMF has been really doing in the developing countries. Through a variety of examples and instances, we have understood this. But also, as we all know, that there are always two sides to the coin. There is a negative aspect and there is positive aspect to it as well. So let us now focus on the other side of the coin and what are the positive role played by the IMF in the entire world and the global economy. Now, IMF has worked tremendously well in 3 important areas. First is promoting stability in the world, in the economic policies of the world. Second is improving the governance. And third is providing debt relief. Now, while promoting the stability, IMF's financial assistance basically helps to stabilize the economies which are going through turmoil. This can be seen in the example of India as well, when in 1991, we were going through economic turmoil, balance of payment crisis, and we were not having money, and we were not even having foreign exchange to the tune of 2 weeks to sustain our imports. In that time, IMF helped us and also helped our economy to be stabilized. At the backdrop of the Asian financial crisis in 1997 also, IMF provided close to $10 billion loans to Indonesia. It also helped the Indonesian economy to be stabilized and become more resilient. Now, IMF conditionalities can also help the government to come up with more transparent and better governed economic policies, which are made by well-learned researchers and experts. And definitely we all know that IMF provides debt relief to the low-income countries. IMF is basically having a HIPC initiative, that is heavily indebted poor countries initiative. Now, this was launched in the year 1996 and provided significant debt reliefs to over 30 lower income countries, which basically helped them to ease their financial burden. Now, in order to ensure that International Monetary Fund and also the World Bank, rather than serving the interests of the Western political and economic elites and American investors and businessmen, they should be serving the interests of the poor. They should be serving the interests of the underdeveloped nations, developing countries and low-income developing countries especially. And this can be done with the three important reforms which can be taken in the IMF. First is in relation to the transparency. The IMF should be increasingly transparent. Transparency in conditionalities, transparency in decision making, and conditionalities attached to the loans can help IMF foster trust again with the developing countries. Also, second reforms should be bringing in tailored solutions. The IMF should not be having cut copy paste solutions. Rather than that, the IMF solutions should be tailored according to the specific needs of that particular developing nation. It should not be that the IMF is having a similar treatment for all the ailments which are going on in the country. They should be having tailor-made specific solutions for different countries. Also, the third reform should be focusing on a long-term growth. Rather than having a parochial view of short-term growth and short-term stability, IMF should be looking towards long-term growth and long-term future of the nations. Definitely short-term stability is required, but more emphasis should be put on long-term stability and long-term growth of a nation, which is definitely in the current times overlooked by the IMF. Now, IMF can definitely be a valuable tool for the development of the world, but its effectiveness hinges on recognizing these criticisms and working towards a more inclusive and a more better equitable future and a more equitable world. I hope you gained a new perspective from this session. Any comments which you might have in relation to IMF and World Bank, I'll be very happy to read them. All the very best and have a very nice day.